Hello, this is Court Watch with Alex Swoyer, and I'm excited to bring you the latest episode of my podcast where I am joined by Andrew Willinger, a law professor and executive director of Duke Center for Firearms Law. He's joining me to break down an upcoming case that the Supreme Court will hear March 4th, where Mexico has sued U.S. gun manufacturers, alleging that they have aided and abetted the drug cartel's violence when American firearms are used across the border. The Mexican government is suing to hold the companies accountable for billions of dollars. The district court had ruled against the Mexican government, reasoning that gun manufacturers cannot be held liable when their guns are used in crimes. But the appeals court reversed that decision, and that prompted Smith & Wesson to ask the Supreme Court to hear their appeal. Thank you, Professor Willinger, for joining my podcast. I think the most interesting case in the upcoming sitting is the Smith & Wesson brands versus Estados Unidos Mexicanos. So the Mexican government had sued these gun manufacturers here, right? And I guess it seems odd to most people and to myself, having covered the court for, I guess it's been like 7 years, for another country to sue American companies in our court system basically over alleged crimes or criminal activity that's happening in their countries by gangs, that sort of thing. It just feels weird to me. It's strange. So I was hoping you could kind of break down the case for us and exactly what the justices will be deciding.
Sure, absolutely. And thanks so much for having me on the podcast. So yeah, I share your impression that this is a somewhat unique case, and the case involves a federal statute that was passed in 2005 called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, often referred to as PLACA. And I think it might help to just briefly talk about sort of what led to that statute being enacted, which is that in the 1990s, there was some high-profile litigation against U.S. gun manufacturers, usually by cities. So the city of Philadelphia, for example, brought some of these lawsuits. And the general theory in those cases was that these gun makers should be held liable for the sort of downstream costs of gun violence that were being imposed on, municipal governments in various ways, including by providing health care and law enforcement and that type of thing. And so there was a series of these lawsuits. Some of them, got past the, a motion to dismiss stage and sort of proceeded on. And as you can imagine, the damages that were alleged in these cases were very high. And there was a resulting backlash, by the firearms industry, and based on the idea that these cases had the potential to basically bankrupt the entire industry because the potential liability was so high. Now, again, these are cases that are brought by domestic entities, usually municipal governments. But they're similar in some ways to the case we're going to talk about today. And so PLACA was enacted in response to those concerns. And PLACA generally immunizes gun makers from claims that are based on a third party's misuse of a firearm that they have manufactured.
Okay, right.
Like commerce.
And so my understanding is in this case, wasn't that like how the district court ruled against Mexico? They cited this?
Exactly. So the district court in the Smith & Wesson case held that Mexico's claims, which Mexico's claims are similar to the theories that were alleged in these earlier lawsuits I mentioned. So Mexico says that the gun manufacturers are aiding and abetting the illegal trafficking of firearms into Mexico. So that the manufacturers are knowingly providing their guns to dealers who then sell to straw purchasers or people who are sort of funneling the guns to Mexican cartels. And then eventually the guns are used in Mexico to commit some kind of crimes or harm. And the Mexico itself is forced to bear the cost of that downstream violence. So you're right. So the district court said that under PLACA, these claims were barred. That the PLACA's sort of immunity shield protected the gun makers in this instance, And the First Circuit Court of Appeals reversed and said that, at this early stage, so we're only at the motion to dismiss stage here, there hasn't been substantial fact finding, there hasn't been a trial, but the circuit court said that at this early stage, Mexico's allegations were sufficient to potentially fit into an exception in PLACA for a violation of, it's called the predicate exception, which basically means that if there's a violation of some underlying statute, so some kind of legal violation that proximately causes harm, then that type of allegation is exempted from the immunity shield.
Okay, and then I know you talked about the line of cases that got us to PLACA, and those were domestic. So this one is obviously involves another country. So is there a certain case that Mexico is relying on, or is there a precedent on this, or is this like one of those things that's a kind of a case of first impression that's going to kind of set a standard within PLACA, or, I mean, I guess potentially explore that exception?
Right. So I think it's really the latter. So this is the first case that the Supreme Court will hear dealing with PLACA. They've had this, the justices have had opportunities over the past decade or so to take cases, but typically what happens is that because the damages that are alleged tend to be very high, if these cases get past the motion to dismiss, gun manufacturers have tended to settle them. So there was a case, for example, arising from the Sandy Hook shooting that went up to the Connecticut Supreme Court, and those claims were allowed to proceed under an exception to PLACA, and then the case was settled, and the Supreme Court didn't take it up. So this is the first time that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to consider the scope of PLACA, and I think it will set an important precedent. And specifically with regard to how broad this so-called predicate exception is. So, when can companies be sued if they knowingly violate a predicate statute, notwithstanding PLACA?
I guess that kind of brings me into my next thought is that I noticed I always like to see what different briefs are filed in cases from different organizations and experts, and a few of your well-known American gun control groups have filed in this one on behalf of Mexico. So what do we make of that? Are those usually persuasive to the justices? Do they look at amici for guidance?
It really depends on the case, but I think it's fair to say that here you have a sort of a pretty standard amici sort of lineup, as you might see in a Second Amendment case, for example, where you have gun rights groups filing in support of the petitioner gun manufacturers, and then, as you noted, you have some major gun control groups and sort of other groups that are on the more liberal or progressive side of the aisle filing in support of Mexico. And I think that makes sense because although this isn't a Second Amendment case, there are sort of atmospheric arguments being raised about Second Amendment rights. Mm-hmm. And you see this in some of the amicus briefing that, these, if allowed to proceed, these types of claims could have a detrimental effect on the ability of Americans to exercise their Second Amendment right by sort of drying up the supply of firearms. And so the presence of that type of argument in the case, I think, leads similar groups to get involved as would be involved in a major Second Amendment case.
You talked about, the Sandy Hook situation and some domestic cases. I guess my question would be how the justices come out here. Could it impact mass liability with mass shootings here domestically, or does it depend kind of how the opinion is crafted?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it depends in large part how the opinion is written. We have seen a push by some U.S. state governments to sort of widen some of these exceptions to PLACA by writing state laws that are specifically designed to serve, for example, as predicate violations for this exception to PLACA that I mentioned. And so I think, you could imagine an opinion that really narrows the scope of this exception, really sort of reinforces the idea that PLACA is a far-reaching immunity shield for the gun industry. And you can imagine that having some real consequences at the state level, where we're seeing some of these efforts to allow more tort claims to be brought against gun industry members. By contrast, if the court were to focus more on proximate cause, which is a major issue that's been brought up in the briefing in the case, and this idea that maybe Mexico's theory is sort of identified a harm that's uniquely attenuated from the actual conduct by the gun makers because you're dealing with cross-border trafficking and all these intervening acts. This is what the gun manufacturers argue in their brief. If the court focuses on that aspect of the case, then I think it's somewhat less impactful for these domestic efforts to allow cases to be brought even under PLACA.
This kind of brings me to one of my last questions is there a certain justice that you're going to be listening to during oral arguments? I guess it's March 4th that this case is heard, or certain line of questioning that you're specifically interested in that we should be paying attention to kind of have an idea maybe? I know everyone likes to try to guess which way the court will go. Yeah,
absolutely. So I don't know that I have a specific justice that I would be focused on here. I mean, I think probably you could expect a lineup, again, given, as I said, the sort of atmospheric Second Amendment gun rights arguments in the case. You could, I think, start off by expecting maybe a lineup as we've seen in the court's recent Second Amendment jurisprudence, which is usually this kind of 6-3 conservative liberal split with Justices Kavanaugh and Barrett, and then Chief Justice Roberts, maybe sort of in the middle, and that three justice group being potentially being able to swing the decision one way or another in any given case. And so I guess those three would be ones to watch, in terms of signs of where the case might be headed and what the decision might look like. I should add, I guess, that I expect the court to reverse here and to hold that Mexico's claims are barred. And I think that's just sort of reading a little bit into the fact that the court decided to take this case in the first place. Mm-hmm. This, as I mentioned, this is still in a pretty early stage, and so I think it would have been relatively easy for the court to say, well, we're going to let this play out, and we're going to
before we got involved. Exactly.
So we're going to let the district court find some more facts and kind of see what Mexico can put forward to support its allegations, and then maybe down the road we'll get involved. But I think the fact that the court chose to take the case at this early stage signals that they're likely to reverse. But again, it's just a question of how many justices are on that side. And again, those three that I mentioned, the Chief Justice and Justices Kavanaugh and Barrett, maybe they might all be in favor of reversing, or maybe some of them will have a different view.
And usually, they wrap up their term at the end of June, and since this one's being heard in March, and it could be, like you predicted, possibly like a 6-3 split. Do you think this is one we get in June, later in the month? Is this one of those ones we kind of have to wait until the very end to find out?
Yeah. It's always a little bit precarious to make predictions about when the decisions will come down. So honestly, your guess is as good as mine. But I think that depends in large part on how the argument goes. Mm-hmm. And I think we might be able to get some clues on if there are some justices that really seem persuaded by what Mexico's attorneys are saying. Then maybe it could be sort of a June, end of term release if we're really going to get some serious back and forth in the majority and the dissent. But if there's not a lot of appetite on the court for letting these claims proceed and maybe writing sort of a narrow decision of the type that I alluded to earlier, where they're not opining broadly on the scope of this exception. They're just saying like this is a unique set of facts where there are too many intervening steps in the causal chain. Then that could be, maybe a more close to unanimous decision even, and that could potentially come earlier.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for taking time to chat with me about this one. I'll have to have you back to react to the decision once we get it and see if these predictions were right.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of Court Watch. If you have not subscribed yet to this podcast, please do so, and also feel free to email me interesting questions or topics you want explored about the legal reporting world. I'll do my best to answer them during each episode. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you all soon. Listen to my podcast, Court Watch, at WashingtonTimes.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.